Laughter echoed through the small roadside diner. A group of young men, halfway through their hamburgers, pointed and chuckled at an old man in a torn coat who had just walked in. His shirt was so worn it was ripped at the elbows. His shoes had no heels left, and his gray hair hung loosely to his shoulders. He quietly took a seat near the window without a word. "Hey, old man, this isn't the homeless shelter." One voice sneered. The young waitress looked uneasy, dropping a menu on his table with a mix of pity and disdain. Just as the tension in the air thickened, the diner door swung open. The town's police chief, broad-shouldered, his badge shining on his chest, stepped. Inside, he was speaking to an employee when his eyes suddenly froze. He wasn't staring at the old man's wrinkled face, nor at his ragged clothes, but at a small glint of metal peeking from the torn pocket, the Medal of Honor of the United States Army. The boy who would one day become the ragged old man in a roadside diner was born in the Steel Belt heart of Ohio. His name was James Harlan, though most people in the neighborhood called him Jamie. Jamie's childhood was painted in muted colors, gray smoke curling from factory chimneys, black dust that clung to the windowsills, the dull brown of muddy streets after a rain. It was a world where men came home from the steel mill with shoulders slumped and hands burned raw, and women carried the weight of families on their backs with quiet strength. His father, Thomas Harlan, worked 12-hour shifts in the blast furnaces. His face was permanently lined with soot, and his eyes carried the weariness of a man who had seen too many winters and too little rest. Yet Thomas was proud of his work, proud of the country he lived in, proud of the flag that hung in the living room, even though the edges had begun to fray. His mother, Margaret, was a schoolteacher. She had the patience of someone who believed knowledge was a weapon stronger than any rifle. At night, when Thomas sat wordless at the kitchen table, Margaret read aloud from tattered books of history, hoping to keep the spirit of learning alive. In her children, Jamie had a younger sister, Clara, a delicate child with wide eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She adored her older brother. When Jamie walked down the street, Clara trailed behind him like a shadow, clutching his hand and staring up as if he were already larger than life. Yet life in Ohio was not easy. The 1950s rolled into the 1960s, and factories cut wages even as prices rose. The town had a way of swallowing boys wholesome into steel, some into trouble. By the time Jamie was 16, he had already buried 2 friends who had died in accidents at the mill. He swore he would not spend his life chained to the furnace. Like his father, breathing in smoke until his lungs turned black. But destiny had its own plans. The call to serve in 1967. The Vietnam War blared across television screens. Images of helicopters lifting off from burning jungles, body counts read like baseball scores, protests swelling in the cities. For some in Ohio, the war felt far away. For others, it was a chance to prove loyalty to a nation that promised greatness. Jamie was 19 when the draft lottery loomed like a storm cloud. He had just finished high school, not a stellar student, but hardworking. He could have tried for college, could have searched for a deferment, but something inside him rebelled at the thought of hiding while others went in his place. One evening, he walked home to find his father polishing his only good pair of boots, silent as always, and his mother marking papers at the kitchen table. Clara was humming softly, playing with paper dolls. "I'm going down to the enlistment office tomorrow," Jamie said suddenly. Margaret's pen froze mid-mark. Thomas looked up, his jaw tightening. For a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, his father said, "If you do this, you do it with your head high. Not because you're running from something, not because of pride. It's because you believe it's your duty." Jamie nodded. He didn't have the words to explain it. All he knew was that something inside him pushed him forward. A sense of responsibility, a desire to matter, maybe even a hunger for escape. That night, Clara slipped into his room. She was only 12, her eyes wide with fear. "Don't go," she whispered, clutching his sleeve. "Don't leave me here." Jamie knelt beside her and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I'll come back," he promised. "I'll always come back." But he never said in what condition. Training the Soldier Marine Corps boot camp at Paris Island was a shock to every nerve in Jamie's body. The Ohio boy who had once spent lazy afternoons fishing in the creek now woke before dawn to the bellowing of drill instructors. His muscles burned, his feet blistered, his lungs screamed for air. He learned to march, to crawl, to shoot, to obey without hesitation. He learned the taste of sand in his teeth and the ache of exhaustion in every bone. He learned to strip and assemble a rifle blindfolded, to keep moving even when his body screamed to stop. But more than that, he learned brotherhood. The men around him, farm boys from Iowa, street kids from New York, mechanics from Texas, became closer than family. They teased him about his quiet nature, called him Ohio. But when the lights went out at night and the barracks fell silent, they shared fears, hopes, and promises of what they'd do if they'd ever made it home. By the end of training, Jamie no longer felt like just a boy from Ohio. He was a Marine. Departure the day he shipped out, Margaret clutched him as if she could anchor him to the ground. Her tears wet his collar as she begged him to stay safe. Thomas shook his hand firmly. Pride hidden beneath the silence. And Clara sweet, Clara pressed something into his palm before he boarded the bus. It was a small photograph of the two of them by the creek, smiling under summer sun. On the back, she had written in shaky handwriting, "Come back, Jamie, please," as the bus rumbled away. Jamie pressed the photo to his chest and stared out the window. The familiar streets blurred into fields, the fields into highways, the highways into the unknown. He was 19 years old, carrying only a duffel bag, a uniform, and a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. The ocean voyage had been long, but the final descent onto Vietnamese soil was abrupt. When the plane's wheels struck the tarmac at Da Nang, the air inside the transport shifted. The men had been joking moments before, trading smirks and half-hearted bravado. But as the ramp lowered and the thick jungle heat rushed in, the laughter evaporated. It was like stepping into another world. The humidity clung to James Harlan's skin like an invisible hand, squeezing the breath out of him. The air smelled of fuel, smoke, and something earthy, almost rotten. Helicopters thundered overhead in endless rotation, lifting off with their cargo of men and supplies, landing again heavy with the wounded. The sight of bandaged bodies being carried past them on stretchers silenced every new recruit. This was no training ground. This was war first. Patrol the first days blurred into weeks. James was assigned to a Marine unit tasked with patrolling the hills near Khe Sanh, an outpost wedged into hostile territory. The terrain was brutal, dense jungle that seemed alive with shadows, red clay that sucked at boots, and rain that fell without warning, soaking them to the bone. Every sound carried, meaning a snapping twig could be a booby trap. The rustle of leaves might be the enemy waiting to ambush. At night the jungle whispered with insects, and the men lay awake, clutching their rifles, hearts pounding at every unfamiliar cry. James quickly learned that war was not about glory. It was about endurance, hours of exhaustion, sweat dripping down his back, mud caking his clothes, and the endless ache in his legs.
Ow.
He thought of Ohio Offensteel steel mills, his sister's laughter, but those memories felt like they belonged to another man. First contact, it happened on a patrol at dusk. The squad was moving cautiously along a ridge when the jungle exploded. Gunfire cracked through the trees. The air filled with the deafening roar of AK-47s. Men dove for cover, shouting returning fire blindly. James's hands trembled as he fired his M16 into the thick brush. He couldn't see the enemy, only flashes of muzzle fire. His throat was dry, his ears rang. Then the Marine beside him, a boy from Iowa named Carter, screamed and went down. Blood sprang from his chest. Time slowed. Training roared back into his body, overriding terror. James crawled toward Carter, dragging him behind a rock. Bullets snapped against the stone, chipping fragments into his skin. Pressed his hands against Carter's wound, shouting for a medic. By the time reinforcements arrived and the firefight died down, 3 men were dead, 5 more wounded. Carter was among them. James sat in silence that night, staring at the jungle, his hands still stained red. It was then he understood. This war would not give him the chance to be a boy again. It had stolen that the moment the first shot rang. Outthought the siege of Khe Sanh weeks. Later came the night that would define him forever. The Marines were ordered to hold a hill near Khe Sanh, a critical point in the region. Supplies had been stretched thin, morale stretched thinner. Rumors spread that the enemy was preparing a massive assault. On a moonless night, the attack came. Mortar rained down, shaking the earth like thunder. Explosions lit the hilltop in. Brief flashes revealing men scrambling, shouting, firing into the darkness. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the metallic temps of blood. James's shoulder burned as shrapnel tore into him, but adrenaline kept him moving. He saw Corporal Diaz, lying motionless near the trench, chest rising weakly. Without thinking, James leaped from cover, sprinting into the hail of bullets. He dragged Diaz back, muscles screaming, the weight of another man pressing down on his wound. Moments later, he spotted Private Miller pinned under debris, his leg mangled. Again, James went. Again, he pulled someone from death's grasp. The third was Sergeant O'Reilly, bleeding out by the sandbags. James hauled him to every step a battle, bullets tearing the air around him. Felt the sting of more shrapnel slice across his back, but he did not stop. By dawn, the hill was littered with silence. Smoke curled upward like ghosts. American and Vietnamese alike lay strewn across the red earth. Out of James's squad, only 4 men survived. Aftermath when the relief column finally reached them. James sat slumped against a rock, pale from blood loss, his uniform torn to rags. Diaz, Miller, and O'Reilly lay alive beside him, saved by his refusal to leave them behind. A lieutenant, shaking his head in disbelief, muttered, "You should be dead 10 times over." James didn't answer. He stared blankly at the jungle, his mind replaying the faces of those who hadn't made it. Men he had shared cigarettes with. Men who had laughed about girls back home. Men who would never go home again. The nomination in the weeks that followed, James was evacuated for treatment. His shoulder wound required surgery, his body riddled with scars. But the paperwork began moving through channels. His commanding officer had witnessed his actions, and the nomination was clear: the Medal of Honor. When they told him, James felt nothing. He didn't want a medal. He wanted his friends back. That night in the hospital ward, Clara's photograph slipped from his pocket. Her handwriting stared back at him. "Come back, Jamie. Please." He had come back, but at what cost? The telegram arrived in neat official lettering. James Harlan, still recovering in a military hospital, stared at it with a blank face as the words blurred in his vision. "You are hereby invited to the White House to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor from the President of the United States." The other wounded Marines in the ward slapped his back, offered congratulatory handshakes, and muttered, "Hell of a thing, Ohio. You deserve it." But James didn't feel deserving. He felt numb. The medal, even before he held it, was already heavier than the shrapnel still lodged in his body. The ceremony, Washington, D.C., glittered with ceremony and formality. Rows of officers in crisp uniforms, dignitaries in polished shoes, television cameras clicking like machine guns. James stood in a starched dress uniform, the collar choking him, fabric stiff against his scars. The president himself charming. Commanding placed the ribbon around Javel's neck as reporters leaned forward to capture the moment. Courage in the face of overwhelming enemy fire. The president's voice boomed. This young Marine carried his wounded comrades to safety, disregarding his own injuries. "Today we honor him as one of our nation's bravest sons." Applause thundered. Flashbulbs burst like flares on the battlefield. James stood motionless, staring straight ahead, his jaw tight. He heard the words, but felt none of them. Behind his eyes, he saw Carter bleeding out in the mud. He saw Diaz gasping for breath, O'Reilly screaming in pain. He saw Miller's face when the helicopter finally lifted them away. He felt the weight of the medal pressing down like a stone. The parade back home when James returned to Ohio. The town greeted him as a hero. Flags waved along Main Street. Mayor gave a speech. Children perched on their father's shoulders, waving tiny flags as the parade marched past. James sat in the back of a convertible, the Medal of Honor gleaming on his chest, people cheering his name. He forced a smile for the crowd, but inside he wanted to crawl into the shadows. His mother, Margaret, clutched his arm after the parade, tears streaming down her cheeks. "My son, my brave boy." His father, Thomas, shook his hand silently. Pride etched into every line of his face. Clara hugged him so tightly he thought she'd never let go. But that night, when the crowds had gone and the lights dimmed, James sat alone in his childhood bedroom staring at the medal on his nightstand. He whispered into the darkness, "I don't deserve this. They're the ones who deserve it, not me." Nightmares the weeks turned into months. James tried to adjust to resume the life of an ordinary young man. But the war followed him everywhere. At night he woke drenched in sweat, hearing phantom gunfire. Sometimes he woke screaming, fists clenched as if holding a rifle. Other nights he simply sat on the edge of the bed, trembling, staring at Clara's old photograph, whispering names. Of men long dead, daylight offered no escape. Fireworks on the 4th of July sent him diving for cover. The hiss of steam from the steel mill made him flinch. Even the sight of rain pooling in ditches brought back the jungle mud. His mother tried to soothe him. His father told him to be strong, but neither could reach him. A marriage, in its collapse in 1970. James married a local girl named Linda. She was kind, hopeful, believing she could love away the shadows in him. For a time, James thought maybe she was right. Got a job at the factory, bought a small house, even laughed again. But the nightmares never stopped. Some nights he would wake shouting. Other nights he would leave the bed entirely, pacing the living room with his rifle clutched in shaking hands. Linda begged him to get help. The VA hospital offered pills, brief counseling sessions, but nothing silenced the ghosts. 2 years later, the marriage ended. Linda left quietly, a note on the kitchen table. "I love you, but I can't live inside this war anymore." James didn't blame her. Couldn't live inside it either. The weight of the medal wherever he went, the Medal of Honor followed him. When he applied for jobs, employers treated him like a celebrity at first. When he lost focus, when he drank too much, when the war intruded again, they let him go quietly. Neighbors whispered. Some admired him, others pitied him. Few resented him, muttering about a baby killer when Vietnam turned unpopular. The medal itself sat in a small box he carried everywhere. He never displayed it, never spoke of it, never wore it, except when forced to. It wasn't a badge of pride. It was a gravestone, polished and gleaming, for the men who hadn't come home. Sometimes, late at night, he opened the box and stared at it. His hand trembled as he whispered, "Why me? Why not them?" No answer ever came. Clara's visit years passed. Clara grew up, married, had children of her own. She visited James often, bringing food, sitting in silence with him. She told her, "Kids, their uncle was a hero," but James always shook his head. "I'm no hero," he'd mutter. "Heroes don't come home. Heroes are the ones who gave everything." Clara would place a hand on his arm. "He gave everything to Jamie. He just kept breathing." James didn't believe her. A life in fragments by the late 1970s, James drifted from job to job, never staying long. Construction, truck driving, even janitorial work. The medal came with him, tucked in his pocket like a curse he could not abandon. Alcohol became his companion. It dulled the edges of memory but never erased them. Some nights he drank until the room spun, until sleep claimed him without dreams. Other nights, even whiskey could not silence the jungle. Friends faded away. His parents grew old and died. Clara moved farther into her own life. By his 40s, James lived alone. The world forgetting him, even as the medal in his pocket whispered reminders of a past he could never escape. The 1980s arrived with neon lights and a booming economy, but none of that seemed to touch James Harlan. For him, the years after the war did not progress in bright chapters, they blurred into shadows. Days folded into nights, towns folded into towns, faces folded into other faces, until he could hardly tell them apart. The drifter James learned how to move lightly through the world. He carried little more than a duffel bag, a worn coat, and a small box containing the Medal of Honor, That box was the one thing he never lost. Never pawned, never left behind in a motel drawer. He worked when he had to. Construction jobs, truck stops, cleaning shifts at night. Sometimes he lasted weeks, sometimes only days. Employers liked the way he started, disciplined, sharp, strong, but then the cracks appeared. He would drift off into silence mid-conversation, snap awake at loud noises, drink too much, or disappear for days. Eventually, every boss gave the same speech. "Sorry, Jim, you're a good man, but this just isn't working out." And so he kept moving. Kansas, Missouri, Arkansas, Texas. A map of America unfolded in his footsteps, yet none of it ever felt like home. Shadows in the bottle whiskey dulled the noise. That was the truth he discovered. A bottle could mute the screaming helicopters in his head. It's a smell of burning foliage that never really left his nostrils. But it was a liar's silence. The nightmares always came back when the bottle emptied. Sometimes he woke in a cheap motel room, knuckles bleeding from punching walls in his sleep. Sometimes he found himself on the floor, soaked in sweat, heart pounding as if the war had never ended. Bartenders grew to know his face, though rarely his name. He was the quiet man at the end of the bar, hunched over a glass, eyes staring into something far beyond the room. Few asked about the ribbon in his pocket when it slipped into view, but James always tucked it away quickly. Shaking his head, "It's nothing," he muttered. "Just a piece of metal." But he knew it wasn't nothing. It was everything. Invisible among crowd cities grew louder. America moved on. The war faded into history books, taught in classrooms James never entered. People talked about stock markets, computers, movies, and music. Few spoke about Key San. Few remembered the faces he still carried, in bus stations and diners. James blended in with the forgotten. Men with hollow eyes, women clutching children too tightly, drifters who smelled of rain and dust. Sometimes, when strangers mocked his ragged coat or ignored him altogether, he almost preferred it. It was easier to be invisible than to be recognized as something he could no longer live up to. A hero, a glimmer of humanity. All days were shadows. Some days, humanity flickered back to life. In Oklahoma, he once fixed a flat tire for a young mother stranded on the roadside. She pressed a $20 bill into his hand, insisting he'd take it. James shook his head, smiling faintly. "Keep it. Buy your kid something instead." In Nebraska, he sat on a park bench feeding crumbs of bread to pigeons. An old man struck up a conversation, never once asking about the war. They talked about baseball, weather, and the way autumn leaves crunched underfoot. For an hour, James felt like just another man in the world. These moments never lasted, but they reminded him that somewhere inside, he was still human. The medals weighed every night. Wherever he ended up, a cot in a shelter, the back of a pickup truck, a rented room that smelled of mildewjums, kept the medal close. Sometimes he laid it on the nightstand, staring at it in the dim light. Other times he held it in his palm. Whispering names into the dark, Carter, Diaz, Miller, O'Reilly, he told himself he carried the medal not for pride, but for memory. To let go of it would be to let them die again. And so, though everything else in his life crumbled, the medal remained. Small box, heavy burden. Fading connections. Clara was the only family who stayed in touch. She sent letters when she could, though James often moved before they arrived. Occasionally, she tracked him down through mutual acquaintances. Once, she even found him in a small Texas town and brought him home for Thanksgiving. The children called him Uncle Jamie. They asked about the war. He deflected with vague stories about jungles and helicopters, careful not to darken their innocent eyes. But when Clara caught him staring out the window, jaw clenched. She knew the ghost still lived with him. "Come stay," she pleaded once. "We'll make room. You don't have to keep drifting." James shook his head. "I don't belong in a house anymore. I wouldn't know how to live in one." Growing old in shadows by the time he turned 50, James looked older than his years. His hair, once dark, was streaked with silver. His shoulders slumped from decades of labor and nights without sleep. He stopped trying to hold jobs. Instead, he survived on odd work, government checks, and the kindness of strangers. He avoided crowds, kept to the edges of towns, fading deeper into the background of America's endless hum. Yet, no matter how invisible he became, the metal in his pocket was a constant reminder that once long ago his life had burned with a different kind of fire. A pull toward home in the late 1990s, something shifted. James began drifting eastward, as if some invisible tether was pulling him back to Ohio. Perhaps it was Clara's letters. Perhaps the ache of age, or perhaps the simple truth that every wanderer eventually circles back to where he began. Each mile closer to Ohio carried a strange mixture of dread and comfort. Would anyone remember him? Would anyone care? One rainy afternoon, tired and hungry, James stepped into a roadside diner. His coat was frayed, his shoes nearly falling apart, his hair damp from the storm. He wanted only a cup of coffee, maybe a sandwich if he could afford it. What he didn't know was that the diner would be the place where the shadows of his past would collide with the present hand, where the metal he carried so quietly for decades would finally speak louder than his silence. Rain lashed against the roadside diner as the afternoon sky turned the color of steel. Cars hissed past on wet asphalt, and the neon open sign flickered uncertainly in the window. Inside, the air smelled of coffee, bacon grease, and fryer oil. The laughter of a group of young men at the counter filled the room, their voices loud enough to drown out the soft hum of the jukebox in the corner. The door swung open, and for a moment the rain blew in with the wind. An old man stepped across the threshold. A ragged stranger, James Harlan's coat was frayed at the sleeves, its once brown fabric now washed into a tired gray. His shoes cracked at the seams, left faint wet prints across the tiled floor. His hair, silver and damp from the storm, clung in messy strands to his forehead. He looked like countless drifters who passed through town, forgotten men who carried the weight of invisible years. He paused just inside the doorway, adjusting the strap of his duffel bag. His eyes scanned the room quickly, not lingering, the instinct of someone who had lived too long on the edges of suspicion. Then, without a word, he walked to a booth by the window and lowered himself onto the cracked vinyl seat. The room had already noticed him. The mockery, hey. One of the young men at the counter snickered, his mouth still full of hamburger. Look who wandered in. Guess the shelter's full tonight. His friends laughed, elbowing each other, their voices thick with the careless arrogance of those who had never gone without. The waitress, young woman no older than 20, hesitated before approaching. She set a menu on the table with a forced smile, her eyes darting over his wet clothes, the dirt smudged into the lines of his hands. Coffee? She asked flatly. Yes, ma'am, James said, his voice quiet but steady. She turned away quickly, as though the sound of his voice unsettled her. Behind him, the laughter at the counter grew louder. Bet he'll order water and ask for free bread. Place ought to start charging rent for guys like that. James heard it all, but his face betrayed nothing. He had grown used to mockery. It had been his companion for decades. He folded his hands. In front of him, the way he used to before meals in the field, and waited. The small ritual when the coffee came. Steaming in a chipped mug, James reached into his coat pocket. His fingers brushed the familiar small box, the Medal of Honor. The one thing he carried through every motel, shelter, and bus ride. He never showed it unless forced. But he always checked to make sure it was still there, like a ritual today. In the act of pulling his hand free, the box shifted. The ribbon slipped partially into view, a faint glimmer of blue and bronze against the frayed fabric of his coat. The waitress didn't notice. The boys at the counter didn't notice. But someone else did. The police chief. The door opened again, this time letting in a gust of fresh rain and the solid frame of Police Chief Daniel Walker. He was a man in his 50s, broad-shouldered, with the air of someone who had carried authority long enough to wear it naturally. His uniform was pressed, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He greeted the waitress with a nod, shook the rain off his hat, and glanced around the diner. His eyes moved across the counter, the booths, and then landed on the old man by the window. For a moment, Chief froze. It wasn't the ragged clothes or the weathered face that caught his Attention! It was the glint of bronze and ribbon barely visible in the man's pocket. A glint he recognized instantly, the Medal of Honor. Recognition begins. Walker's chest tightened. His father had served in Korea, his uncle in Vietnam. He had grown up hearing stories of men who earned that medal, stories of sacrifice so immense they bordered on myth. And now, sitting in front of him, was a man everyone else dismissed as a beggar. The chief took a slow breath, his eyes never leaving James. He saw the way the man sat quietly, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes lowered to his coffee as though trying to disappear. He saw the dignity in his silence, the weariness in his stillness. And suddenly, Walker's perspective shifted. He no longer saw a drifter. He saw a Marine. The room holds its breath. The laughter at the counter continued, oblivious. The young men joked louder, trying to provoke a reaction. One mimicked a beggar's voice. Another pretended to stumble toward the old man's booth. But James didn't move. He stirred his coffee slowly, the spoon clinking. Against the ceramic like a soft clock, the chief's boots echoed across the diner as he began to walk toward the booth. The sound caught the attention of the room. Faltered. The boys turned, their laughter trailing into awkward silence. The waitress froze mid-step. James looked up, his tired blue-gray eyes meeting the chief's steady gaze. For a long moment, no one else existed in that diner. A soldier's salute. Chief Walker stopped at the edge of the booth. His voice was low, respectful, almost reverent. "Sir, were you at Kisan?" The diner went silent. Even the jukebox seemed to pause. The young men exchanged confused glances, their smirks fading. James didn't answer immediately. His eyes flicked down to his pocket, then back up. Slowly, he gave a single nod. Walker removed his hat and, right there in the middle of the greasy roadside diner, brought his hand to his brow in a crisp salute. The boys at the counter sat frozen. The waitress's eyes widened. Every person in the room felt the weight of a truth they had nearly trampled. This ragged man was not who they thought he was. The silence that fell over the diner was almost tangible, pressing down on everyone present. A moment earlier, the air had been thick with laughter and derision, the careless mocking of youth. Now, it was hushed, reverent, as if the walls themselves understood the gravity of what had just been revealed. The police chief's salute held steady. His eyes did not waver from the man sitting before him, the man others had dismissed as a vagrant, a drifter, a nobody. To Chief Walker, the glint of bronze and blue told another story. It told the story of sacrifice, of courage, a battlefield half a world away. James Harlan shifted uncomfortably in his booth. He had never sought attention, never craved recognition. If anything, he despised it. Yet here it was again, unbidden, crashing into his quiet world like a wave against a forgotten shore. He lowered his gaze to his coffee, his voice rough but calm. "Please, son, sit down. Don't make a fuss." But Walker could not help it. His chest swelled with respect, his voice thick with emotion. "Sir, with all due respect, you carried that medal for all of us. You deserve more than silence." A churning of the room, the young men at the counter shifted in their seats, shame creeping into their faces. A few moments ago they had been laughing, their voices loud and careless. Now they saw themselves reflected in the chief's salute and they did not like the image staring back. One of them, the ringleader with a cocky grin now faded, cleared his throat and slid awkwardly off his stool. He approached the booth hesitantly, scratching the back of his neck. "Sir, his voice cracked. "I'm sorry, we didn't know." James lifted his eyes, pale blue and tired but not unkind. He studied the boy for a moment, then gave the faintest nod. "You didn't have to know," he murmured. "But you should never laugh at a man just for looking poor. That's a battle you don't see." The boy swallowed hard and stepped back, words lodged in his throat. His friends followed, offering murmured apologies, each one more awkward than the last. The arrogance had drained from them, replaced by something softer, more human respect. Even all, the waitress, the young waitress, who had dropped the menu on James's table earlier with an edge of disdain, now stood frozen near the counter. Her eyes were wide, her cheeks flushed with shame. She walked over slowly, setting down a plate with trembling hands. "On the house," she whispered, voice breaking. "I'm sorry for how I treated you." James looked at the plate, scrambled eggs, toast, and bacon, steaming hot. He hadn't eaten properly in days. For a moment, his chest tightened. The kindness was almost harder to bear than the ridicule. He gave her a gentle smile, small but sincere. "Thank you, ma'am. That's more than enough." The girl blinked rapidly, biting her lip to keep from crying. Walker's words, Chief Walker, finally lowered his salute and sat across from James. For a long time, neither spoke. The room remained quiet, as though everyone was waiting for permission to breathe again. Walker leaned forward, his voice low but steady. "Sir, I grew up hearing stories about men like you. My father fought in Korea. He used to tell me about the Medal of Honor. Said it was more than a medal. Said it was a burden. I didn't understand until now." James exhaled slowly. He wrapped his hands around the coffee mug, letting the heat seep into his bones. His voice was hoarse, almost a whisper. "It is a burden. It's not just for what you did. It's for the ones who didn't come back. Every time I feel its weight, I remember their faces. I carry it because I can't let them be forgotten." Walker nodded solemnly. "And because of that, they never will be." The diner's response around the room, people sat in silence, listening. A middle-aged couple near the window bowed their heads. A trucker at the counter took off his cap and placed it against his chest. Even the young men who had mocked James now stood with their heads lowered, shame etched into their features. It wasn't forced. It wasn't spectacle. It was instinct, a collective recognition that they were in the presence of something rare, something sacred. James, uncomfortable with the weight of their stares, cleared his throat. "Enough now," he said softly. "I don't need all this. I only wanted a cup of coffee." But the truth was, for the first time in decades, the room wasn't looking at him with mockery or pity. It was looking at him with understanding. "A quiet meal," the chief gestured to the plate. "Eat, sir. You've earned it." James picked up his fork and began to eat slowly, methodically. The diner returned to its rhythm, but the tone had shifted. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, respectful. Subdued, the young men went back to their counter seats, but they didn't laugh anymore. Instead, they whispered among themselves, stealing glances at James with something closer to admiration than derision. The waitress refilled his coffee without being asked. Her hand steady now, her expression soft. Each act was small, but together they formed a quiet symphony of respect. The weight lightens as James ate. He felt something he hadn't in years, a loosening in his chest, a faint lifting of the burden he carried. The medal still sat heavy in his pocket, but the room's silence had transformed it. For once, it wasn't just a reminder of ghosts. It was a bridge between him and the living, between memory and recognition. He allowed himself to breathe more deeply, to let the warmth of the coffee and the meal spread through him. For the first time in decades, he felt seen not as a drifter, not as a failure, but as a man who had given what he could and survived. Leaving the diner, when he finally stood to leave, the entire room seemed to rise with him. The chief extended his hand firmly, and James shook it with quiet strength. "Thank you for what you did for all of us," Walker said. James gave a faint smile. "Take care of your town. That's more than enough." The young men, eyes downcast, murmured another apology. The waitress, tears welling, said softly, "Come back any time. Your meal will always be waiting." James nodded once, pulled his coat tighter around him, and stepped back into the rain. A gentle ending outside. The storm had eased. The rain was lighter now, almost delicate, and the sky showed faint streaks of pale sunlight breaking through the clouds. James walked down the road slowly, each step steady, the metal pressing against his chest. For the first time in a long while, he did not feel its weight as a curse. He felt it as a reminder, not only of the dead, but of the living who still remembered, still cared. Even if only for a moment in a roadside diner, he allowed himself a small smile. Fragile but real, as the rain washed gently over him, and in that smile was peace. The road stretched out before him, as uncertain as always. But something had shifted inside James Harlan. He was still a wanderer, still a man shaped by shadows. But now he knew that the burden he carried was not his alone. The metal, once unbearable, had found its voice. And for the first time, James walked into the rain not only as a survivor, but as someone finally recognized.